Okay, hello and welcome to Tokyo International University's Global Dialogue. My name is Akitoshi Miyashita, Dean of the English Track Program and Professor of International Relations here at TIU. Today, I am very pleased and honored to introduce our guest speaker, Mr. Daniel Russel. Mr. Russel has a long and distinguished record as a career diplomat. I wish to mention all of his past posts and appointments in detail, but if I do so, it will be over before we get to his talk. So let me mention just a few. Mr. Russel is currently Vice President for International Security and Diplomacy at the Asia Society Policy Institute. Previously, he served as the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs under President Barack Obama. He was also the Senior Director for Asian Affairs at the National Security Council. During his tenure there, he helped formulate President Obama's strategic rebalance to Asia-Pacific region. Mr. Russel has kindly agreed to appear on our global dialogue as a guest speaker and talk about Biden and Asia. What's the game plan? He will speak about 20 minutes or so. Then we open the floor for Q&A session. I should mention that all the remarks made during today's global dialogue, including Q&A session, will be on the record. And we are live, not just through the Zoom platform, but also on Facebook. So without further ado, I would like to hand over the floor to Mr. Russel. Mr. Russel.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Miyashita, for the introduction. And it's really a great pleasure for me to speak at Tokyo International University at the Global Dialogue. I only wish that I could be with you all in person. I really commend all of you who are studying overseas, who've come from other countries to Japan. My own experience as a foreign student is something that really opened my eyes, not only to the world, but it also taught me a lot about my own country, my own identity, where I come from. So as Professor Miyashita mentioned, I'm a former diplomat. I was President Obama's special assistant for Asia Pacific Affairs. And I worked very closely with then Vice President Biden. I accompanied him whenever he traveled to Asia or whenever he met an Asian leader. Many of his top advisors are good friends of mine. Maybe that means I have a little bit of insight, but it also probably means I'm not entirely objective. That said, I feel strongly that these are smart, thoughtful, committed, hardworking, and in my experience, genuinely nice people who are working in the administration. But the issue is, how does the Biden team approach Asia? What is it that they are trying to do? What's their game plan? So I think the starting point is this, that obviously the whole world and Japan, the United States, all of us are in the midst of a catastrophic health emergency, the pandemic. We're also grappling with the economic fallout from the pandemic, and that's very serious. So it means that the Biden administration has come into office at a moment of extraordinary global stress. And that inevitably has an impact on foreign policy decisions. But there are some other factors that go into the equation of how the Biden team will approach Asia, and I'd like to run through some of them. So the first thing I'd mention is that Biden himself and nearly everybody in his national security team and much of his economic team come into government with a lot of experience dealing with the Asia Pacific. Now, that doesn't mean that they're guaranteed to be successful, but it does mean they've probably made most of the mistakes that beginners make. And so they're going to approach the challenge of Asia policy, I think, with more savvy, but also more humility and maybe more resolve than the first time around. I know that it also means that these are people who are absolutely convinced that the economic future and the security interests of the United States are very closely tied to the Asia Pacific region. These aren't people who need to be persuaded about the importance of sustained, active US engagement in the region, whether it's economic or diplomatic or political security, any kind of engagement. They get it. The second thing I would flag is the effect that the previous administration, the Trump administration, had on America's standing, America's reputation, and its relationships. So, as a presidential candidate, Joe Biden's campaign slogan was "Build Back Better." Well, he needs to build back America's global reputation, because polling all around the world shows just a catastrophic drop in confidence in US leadership. And I think this has helped drive a shift among countries in the broader Asia Pacific region. There's more hedging, more fence sitting, more skepticism towards the United States. But at the same time, the same polls show a great deal of suspicion towards China. So it's not a one-way street. It's not an absolute. I think that the experience of many Asia Pacific countries with the US government, with Washington over the past 4 years in the Trump era, means that Biden faces an uphill battle. He's got to work hard to mend fences. He's got to win back the trust and the confidence of partners who've seen things that they don't like, that where the US has abandoned commitments and treaties, has imposed sanctions on many countries, even close allies like Japan or Korea have been denounced as freeloaders. And I think many people throughout the region have watched in horror, as have Americans, as US politics and frankly, much of US society seem to go kind of haywire. So the way that Biden is working to kind of reclaim credibility and a leadership influence is by rejoining international organizations and rejoining agreements, by demonstrating American commitment on issues like climate change, by engaging in very active diplomacy through things like the Quad leaders meeting of a month or so ago, or the summit meeting with Japanese Prime Minister in Washington that's going to take place on Friday. I think that Biden is also demonstrating America's strong commitment to alliance relationships, to democratic values, to universal human rights. These are all things that were downplayed or in some cases just abandoned during the Trump years. But at the same time, you have to recognize that the emphasis on values and human rights increases friction with, say, China. And it can also cause complications or discomfort with other Asian countries that are aligned with the US on some issues, but are not fully democratic societies themselves, or that don't want to be taken to task for human rights practices. There's a third factor I'd mention uh, apropos of China, and that's really the transformation in the direction that China seems to be going in. Certainly a transformation in China's behavior over the past 6, 7 years or so, which is quite significant. So first of all, internally, there are the significant changes that Chinese President Xi Jinping has helped to engineer. Under his rule, China has clearly turned into a much more ideological, nationalistic society. We've seen an intensification of party control over all aspects of life in the country, uh, championing state-owned enterprises, tightening controls over the private sector, restricting space for political debate, etc. And internationally, we've seen significant changes as well. And that includes various forms of coercion. I'm thinking of intensified pressure on Japan through these constant incursions by the Air Force or the Navy into the senkakus in the East China Sea. Thinking of the military pressure and incursions across the Taiwan Strait and the Median Line, or very problematic behavior in the South China Sea, threatening other claimants in that area, or leveraging China's market access, not just as a carrot, but as a stick also, by punishing countries like Australia for sort of political actions by imposing an embargo, or even not just a country, but companies like H&M or the NBA, conducting these state sanctioned boycotts. So, when you think about it, compared to 2009, okay, when Biden entered the White House as vice president, today's China is vastly more activist. We see a much more competitive set of global policies, global behaviors. And, on the flip side of that, in Beijing today, there is tremendous anger towards the United States, a great deal of suspicion towards the United States. That's true among the policymakers, it's true among the general public. And we see a growing sort of anger or contempt for the United States as a angry, declining power that's hell-bent on hurting China's legitimate interests. And that anger is combined with a growing sense of confidence. Some people think it's arrogance that's reflected in China's belief that its time has come, America's time has passed. This is the East is rising, the West is fading idea. And these attitudes in China have spread and have intensified in the past few years. I think at the same time, another significant transformation that I have to mention is the transformation in the attitudes towards China in the region generally, but specifically in the United States. Political elites, business community, the general public, there really is a dramatic change in perception. And so, previous administrations operated under some guiding principles regarding China that now seem very obsolete. You know, the principles of engagement is good, cooperation is good, interdependence is good. You know, those were seen as desirable things, but today in the current environment, they're not. And that means that the Biden administration has much less room to maneuver in terms of its China policy because there's very limited public support for it. So these are some of the factors that I'm flagging to help set the stage. But we should turn to what it is that we think we know about the Biden team's approach to Asia. So I think that first and foremost, the key factor is President Biden's determination to concentrate on domestic recovery and American renewal. Now, that doesn't mean that the Biden administration is so consumed with domestic issues that they don't have the bandwidth to deal with foreign policy. What they're saying is something quite interesting, namely that foreign policy and domestic policy need to work together, need to reinforce each other, need to be complementary. And I think one of the ways that you can understand Biden's sense of the complementary relationship between domestic and international affairs is that, you know, he has a long experience in the Cold War dealing with authoritarian Leninist systems in the Eastern Bloc. And let's face it, the Chinese system, the North Korean system, these are similar in the sense that they are authoritarian and they operate under Leninist Marxist principles. And that what that means is, and this is something that Biden fully understands, in dealing with these systems, with these parties, it's critically important to operate from a position of strength. Now, strength doesn't mean, you know, beating your chest and rhetoric and issuing threats. Doesn't mean like brandishing weapons. And it also doesn't mean that we try to cover up our own problems. But what it does mean is that the other party becomes convinced, based on what they see, that America is resilient, that America is getting back on track, that America is yet again demonstrating its capacity to bounce back after a period of turbulence and of disarray. So coming back to China, you know, a strategy for dealing with China is always going to be an important component of any US administration's Asia policy, certainly in the current era. And I think that the key here is that the Biden team wants to be smart about it. They want to be methodical, they want to be coherent, they want to be integrated, organized in their approach to China policy. And that means thinking things through before launching into policies. So we can see that in the decision at the very beginning to conduct a very careful review of China policy and also to take a close look at the things that they inherited from the previous administration, like all kinds of trade tariffs. So they didn't on day one simply say, okay, we're lifting all these trade tariffs. They're taking their time to get the policies right. They're approaching questions about how best to engage China. That means how best to cooperate with China and where we want to push back against China. To do that in a deliberate way, deliberate and a measured way, to trying to get the messaging right, trying to get the sequence right, thinking it through. So the Biden administration held a very high level in-person meeting between the two top national security officials on each side in Alaska. The two leaders held a long and a substantive phone conversation between them. But the Biden team hasn't rushed into the kind of formal, large-scale institutional dialogues that the Chinese like and are hoping for, the kind that the two countries had in the Bush administration or in the Obama administration, this strategic and security dialogue and so on. Another critically important aspect, I think, of the Biden team's approach to Asia is the priority that they put on consulting with allies and partners, and not just consulting, but making common cause, working together, and this is very different than twisting arms. Are you with us or against us? It's inclusive. It's trying to build a chorus of voices and see what it is that we both or we all agree on. And you have to remember that working with other countries, working with allies, mobilizing multinational groups has been an incredible force multiplier for the United States. But building coalitions, sustaining like-minded groups together is, it's hard even in the best of times, and these are not the best of times. So it's not going to be easy for the Biden people. But what we saw in the recent Quad summit, so the leaders of Japan, the United States, India, and Australia, I found very encouraging. And I'll tell you that in my career, I've been quite a skeptic of the Quad. It always felt to me like more of a talking point than a real thing. But this was very different. I think there's been a big change, that this Quad summit had very, very real, very concrete outcomes. I mean, the big one is a commitment among the four countries to provide 1 billion doses of COVID vaccine to Southeast Asia by the end of the year. And interestingly, the vaccine formula is from the US. The manufacturing of the vaccine itself is done in India. Japan and Australia each have their own role in building out the public health infrastructure, and importantly, in delivering the vaccines, the final mile, the last mile, getting it all the way, not just to an airport, but getting it all the way to the island or the village where it can be administered. So this is a big deal. And I think that also the working groups that the Quad created to help Southeast Asian countries on climate resilience and all kinds of extreme weather and climate challenges. Another working group on sharing emerging technologies with Southeast Asian countries. So what I saw was, okay, this Quad is not focused on military exercises among the four. It's not really focused on the four countries themselves. It's focused on how to benefit the region. And I was also struck by the fact that there was no reference to China in the statement, that this wasn't a platform for criticizing China at all. Although, people will see a contrast, I'm sure, between what the Quad is offering and some of China's regional behavior. So when it comes to international cooperation, it's absolutely clear to me that Biden wants to see real and productive collaboration with Asian partners, and not only with allies like Japan or important partners in Southeast Asia like Vietnam or Indonesia, but also with China. Cooperation on real issues that citizens of both sides actually care about. And I think his record proves that. One other attribute that I'd flag in the approach of the Biden administration is taking a rules-based, values-based approach in foreign policy. That means championing the role of democratic governance. It means active multilateral engagement. It means, equitable rule setting. It means protection of universal rights and universal norms. So what we see is taking a strong stance against the coup in Myanmar, where the Tatmadaw, the military, overthrew the legitimate elected civilian government of the NLD led by Aung San Suu Kyi. It means working with countries in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, in the Pacific, to advance good governance, to fight against corruption, to protect women's rights, civil rights, gay rights, to safeguard press freedom, religious freedom, but also to promote sustainable development, to create economic opportunities. So it's not just a matter of denouncing governments for human rights offenses or for violating international covenants. I think what they are pushing for is to promote good governance, to protect the media, to design ways to push for accountability, and overall to strengthen the role of civil society. So in doing that, they are reasserting a substantial role for the United States in regional organizations and international institutions. They're working with like-minded partners to try to set limits and to enforce international law. Now, the last feature of the Biden approach I'll mention is his determination to compete hard in technology, to secure and advance America's historic edge in tech innovation. Part of that agenda is defensive, to protect intellectual property. But I think the top of the agenda is going to be proactive competition. In other words, for the US to up its own game, to do better. I think, I know that President Biden is determined to compete with China, determined to outcompete China, which is different than trying to block China or harm China. But look, it's going to require, dramatic capacity building in the US, including research and development and infrastructure, education. So right now, President Biden is pushing hard for a bill through Congress and a budget that would allow him to do that. And in recognizing that America needs to get its own act together in order to be effective in meeting international challenges, I think the president is well aware that this is not an easy project, and it's certainly not a short-term project. So the bottom line on Biden is that he's a genuine and a caring human being who understands the importance of communication, including communicating with competitors and even with potential adversaries. And I know from experience that he's somebody who understands that, the essence of communication is listening. is understanding what the other person is trying to say. A mentor of mine used to say, you can't kick somebody towards you, right? You know, you don't persuade people just by winning the argument or by talking over them. You can't persuade them until you've really listened to them, you know, until they feel like you've heard them. That's true in life. It's true in diplomacy. It's true in geopolitics. So, on that note, I'm going to stop talking and listen to what all of you have to say. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Russell, for sharing your thoughts on President Joe Biden's expected Asia policy. Now, I would like to open the floor for Q&A session. If you wish to ask a question or make a comment, please click the raise hand button located on the participants tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please wait to be called and unmuted. Before asking your question, please identify yourself, your name and your institutional affiliation. Okay, we have Professor Hakin Lee from TIU. Professor Hakin Lee, go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Hello, Mr. Russel. Thank you so much for your fascinating talk. May I ask a question on the US response to China's assertive military behavior? As you mentioned, the US has less room to maneuver Beijing nowadays. With the increasing military activities between the two sides, Chinese naval patrol near Taiwan in East and South China Sea, for example, and the US navigations of freedom in the region, would those military activities from both sides lead to a real war in the coming future? So how could the US deliver a powerful diplomatic signal to its allies in the region on one hand, and avoid a military bankmanship with China on the other hand? More important, I would like to note if the two sides, they have any long channel for communicating in order to avoid that kind of potential conflict. Sorry that I forgot to introduce myself. I'm associate professor at TIU Institute for International Strategy, and thank you so much.
Well, Professor Lee, that's an important, good, and difficult question. I feel very strongly that it is absolutely critical that the U.S. and China avoid brinkmanship. There's always a great risk that military signaling, particularly in an atmosphere of tension, doesn't have the intended effect of deterring the other side, but inadvertently has the opposite effect of disturbing and threatening the other side. So this is an area where I think both countries need to be extremely careful. Both countries have large and powerful militaries. Both countries, frankly, are convinced that they are in the right and that the other side is behaving in a provocative manner. So the question you're asking is, without the United States simply conceding the field and withdrawing from the Asia Pacific, how can it affirmatively assert its commitment to regional stability and security without increasing the risk of conflict? The fact is that the good news, I would say, is that both the United States and China have professional militaries. And while the military officers are, of course, tremendously patriotic, they're also very well trained, and they want to avoid inadvertent conflict and accidents in war. But the fact of the matter is that accidents do happen. And we've seen that in 2001, when a Chinese fighter intercepted a US surveillance plane in international waters, the EP3 incident, with the loss of the life of the Chinese pilot and huge political crisis between the two countries. That was an era when, frankly, US-China relations were on a very solid and positive footing. And even so, it was a difficult issue to resolve. If such an incident were to occur today, I think we would be all deeply worried about the ability of the respective governments to effectively manage it. Right now, regrettably, the channels of communication between the US and China have largely atrophied. By the end of the Trump administration, there was essentially no institutional dialogue whatsoever between the US and China. And even in the year before that, it was limited essentially to the trade talks between Vice Premier Liu He and Ambassador Lighthizer. Now, I think that there is an effort afoot under the Biden administration gradually to restore necessary communications, and certainly military to military channels are critically important. But there's a long way to go. There's a high degree of risk. So one part of the answer, of course, will be the professionalism of the military's rules of engagement, responsible behavior. One part of it, however, is also going to be the diplomatic work to restore some degree of balance and cooperation in the overall political relationship. When things are tough, the risk factors go up because it becomes difficult to de-escalate. Nationalists in both countries are egging their leaders on to look tough and to stand tough. When friction is reduced, when the relationship is normalized, those kinds of pressures subside. And so if there is a problem, political leaders have greater space to deal with it. But the United States is not leaving the region, is not going away. And the strong demand signal for American engagement, including the Seventh Fleet, the US military, coming not only from treaty allies like Japan, Korea, Australia, Philippines, Thailand, but also from other countries in Southeast Asia, even former adversaries like Vietnam. That demand signal is an indicator that the American presence is widely perceived as both a stabilizing factor and a necessary balancer to China's growing power. And for all of those reasons, I think that we can be confident that the US presence will continue.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have Professor Jeffrey O'Daniel. Jeffrey, would you like to go ahead and ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Akitoshi. Good morning to you, Mr. Russell. I have a question on the difference between President Obama and President Biden on the South China Sea issue, because many observers, pundits, and scholars have been observing that China continues to push the envelope in the South China Sea simply because it can. I think I remember when China started building artificial islands in the South China Sea, President Obama said there will be consequences. when China placed missile systems, landed bombers on those islands, President Obama said there will be consequences if China continues to militarize the islands. And so we know now that the artificial islands have been completed. They have been pretty militarized. And so for many people here in Asia, there had been no consequence. And so right now, I think there is a Scarborough Shoal-like tension in the South China Sea between the Philippines, which is a treaty ally, and China. And my question is, how different do you think will President Biden's South China Sea policy be compared to that of President Obama? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Daniel. I was in government and working with and advising President Obama during that period, and I worked very directly and closely with Chinese counterparts on issues, including the South China Sea issue. I think that the strategy is what's sometimes called the boiling frog tactic, or the salami slice tactic. Let's face it, in a Leninist system, there's no penalty and no shame to lying to the enemy. That's a perfectly legitimate tactic. And in the early stages of China's reclamation work in the South China Sea and the Spratlys, the Chinese insisted at very high levels, the highest level, in fact, that China had absolutely no intention of militarizing its outposts, that the purpose of the reclamation work was simply to create shelters for fishermen in the typhoon, all that kind of stuff. Now, I'm not suggesting that the US side was terribly gullible, but by the same token, the United States was not a claimant to any of the areas in the South China Sea. And what our concern was that the Chinese deal with the other claimants in a peaceful way that comported with international law. Now, gradually and over time, it became increasingly clear that they weren't, and that Chinese assurances were simply not grounded in the truth. And we see with the benefit of hindsight that the plans had to have been all along to build up these outposts as military forward bases. Now, the US military was not unduly concerned about that, because these are not bases that could be decisive advantages in the event of actual conflict with the United States, because they could be destroyed instantly. They don't move. They're sitting ducks. They're fixed targets. But it was clear that the purpose of these outposts was not to be used in a conflict with the United States, but to intimidate Vietnam, to intimidate Malaysia, Philippines, other claimants, including Indonesia, even though Indonesia wasn't an overt claimant. So when Obama told the Chinese that there would be consequences, what he meant was that in response to Chinese behavior, the United States would expand and enhance its defense and security assurances in the region, strengthen its alliances, and expand its presence. And that's precisely what we did. The United States negotiated the Defense Cooperation Access Agreement with the Philippines. We had similar access agreements that were concluded with Malaysia, with other countries, and the bilateral relationship between the United States and Vietnam improved dramatically, including strategic maritime cooperation and maritime monitoring and awareness. When President Obama told the Chinese that there would be consequences, There were, and one of the forms of the consequence was the Philippine case against China in the Law of the Sea Tribunal, because China's behavior, we felt, directly violated its commitments under the treaty. And lo and behold, not only did the tribunal agree, they categorically ruled in favor of the Philippines and determined that China had no legitimate sovereignty claims in over the specified areas, because none of those features actually were islands, and they couldn't claim more than 12 nautical mile right. So I think that the fact of the matter is that short of a direct conflict, the form of American pushback was through the ASEAN partners. When Rodi Duterte was elected president and opted to throw Philippine equities and the Law of the Sea Tribunal ruling overboard, and rush to the Great Hall of the People and embrace Xi Jinping, well, that put a big hole in the American strategy. And we could not want to defend the rights of the Southeast Asian countries more than the Southeast Asian countries themselves wanted. As far as the difference between the Biden administration's approach and the Obama administration's approach, obviously there's a lot we don't know yet, since the Biden people have only gotten into place. But what we do know is that the world has changed, the region has changed, China's behavior has changed, and there are no longer any illusions about what it is that China is doing in Spratly, doing to Vietnam, doing against ASEAN through its divide and conquer strategy. So by definition, the Biden administration will have to deviate from what the Obama group did 10 years ago. But I think it will remain true to the basic principles of freedom of navigation, freedom of overflight, and the absolute requirement that all countries, including China, both settle sovereignty disputes, maritime territorial differences peacefully, but also that each country, including and particularly a big country like China, honor its solemn commitments. In this case, its commitments under the law of the sea.
Okay, thank you so much. We have one audience asking questions using the chat room, and I would like to read the question. It's about Myanmar. Could you say more about the Biden administration's ability, willingness to support the democratic movement in Myanmar and hold the junta accountable for the atrocities it is committing against its citizens? How does the administration think about its influence in the region and how it might work with or against China on important humanitarian issues like this?
Well, great question. Thank you. I think that the Biden administration understands that it is not enough just to make rhetorical statements criticizing and condemning the illegal coup by the Tatmadaw. They have taken some very concrete action in terms of sanctions against the commander-in-chief, Min Aung Hlaing, against some of the key generals, and as well as taken action against the military holding companies, which are very important to the Tatmadaw, in order to impose some direct and immediate costs here. But they also understand, I believe, two very important things: that punishment can't be the totality of the strategy. There also has to be an important effort to prevent the situation from getting worse. And I know that the Biden administration is seeking ways to try to discourage further violence by the military against the civilians. I know that the Biden people are trying to communicate and instill confidence and support for peaceful resistance on the part of civil society in Myanmar. And very importantly, the second thing is that they are not just going it alone, not only linking arms with the usual suspects, a few Western countries that are committed to human rights, but working very assiduously with Myanmar's neighbors, not only with Japan and with Korea, but importantly with key members of ASEAN who have potentially great influence and direct lines into the Tatmadaw senior ranks. Lastly, I don't know what the nature of conversations between Washington and Beijing have been on the situation in Myanmar, but it certainly appears to me that there is a convergence of interests between the US and China. That China has no interest in instability or civil war along its borders in Myanmar. That China had a very constructive relationship with the duly elected government led by Aung San Suu Kyi, and despite China's much vaunted non-interference principle, the Chinese are clearly not happy about this coup. So there is space, in my view, for the US and China to explore how they can align their policies to have greater effect.
Okay, thank you so much. Our next question is from Professor Sojin Shin from TIU. Professor Shin?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Russel, for your insightful conversation with us. I have a question about the U.S. new government approach to South Asia, which may not be one of the priorities like the Korean Peninsular problem or Southeast Asian partners you shared. South Asia, where 8 sovereign states, including India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, and others, has various insecurity problems, such as territorial disputes and the U.S. Long engagement with Afghanistan, especially with the war on terrorism and following a state building process, which many IR scholars are actually worried about. What if Afghanistan would become the second Iraq? And India has been getting an increasing attention from the US alliance because many states have an expectation that India and its alliance with the USA could provide a counterbalance to China power. I would love to learn Biden's view on South Asia. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shin. Just to give you one example, when I was in the White House as the senior director, the head of the Asia division, the Asia Bureau in the National Security Council, we had one senior director for all of Asia. Today, the Biden administration has expanded the office so that there are 3 senior directors, so 3 divisions within that big bureau. One to focus on South Asia, one to focus on Northeast Asia, and one to focus on Southeast Asia. So I take that as an indicator that the Biden administration puts considerable weight on South Asia and on relations with South Asia. Now, the most obvious manifestation of that is the strong outreach with India and the work to engage India not only on a bilateral basis, but also on a multilateral basis through the Quad, for example. Afghanistan is a unique problem set. You're right to raise it. And I'll confess that I know less than I should about Afghanistan and Afghanistan policy, although I will say that the news reports just a few hours ago indicate that President Biden has set a clear date for full US withdrawal, September 11th, in fact, 20 years after the terrorist attack. So it's not yet clear to me what form the Biden administration's engagement and outreach to South Asia will take. But I know that it isn't and won't be limited to the big powers, India, or the big trouble spots, Afghanistan, and to some extent to Pakistan. There's been a lot of work done, I know from some of my friends, on issues relating to Sri Lanka, to Nepal, and other South Asian countries. So I can only say that in addition to India, we should expect indicators of expanded engagement. In the first instance, probably through programs relating to the pandemic and to public health. But as the pandemic subsides, I'll return to a broader range of engagement on economic and other areas.
Great. Thank you so much. As we are running out of time, I have read the questions on the chat room, and I will read those questions quickly. You don't have to answer all. You can choose to what questions you would like to answer. But first question is about the economic policy of Biden administration. The previous Trump administration withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Do you think that the Biden administration would return to the TPP, and how Biden's economic engagement in the Asia-Pacific region in response to the Chinese prominent economic presence in the region? And the second question is about Hong Kong. What policy can Biden administration choose to implement in terms of Hong Kong? Is Hong Kong for Mr. Biden and his team equal to Taiwan or Xinjiang or Tibet? Or is there any priorities among them? And the last question is about the US domestic issue. The Trump administration, there was a violence against Black lives, and now in the Biden administration, there is a violence against Asians living in the US. What Biden administration focus on to stop the violation and make peace and harmony? So these are the three questions on the panel. Thank you.
Those are great questions, and there's about 0 time left, so very quickly. To my deep regret, I think there is no realistic prospect in the foreseeable future for the Biden administration to rejoin TPP, or actually to join the CPTPP, largely for political reasons in the United States. I think there may be some elements of the TPP agreement, particularly things pertaining to digital trade and so on, that could form the basis of ad hoc agreements, either bilateral or multilateral. But there's no real political appetite in the Congress for a large US trade initiative. And the administration is quite focused on the more immediate problems. That doesn't mean that it isn't serious about expanding trade, entrepreneurship, innovation, technological cooperation throughout Asia, however. In terms of Hong Kong is a powerful lesson in the adage that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. You know, the opportunities to prevent or discourage the imposition of martial law existed in the past. That law had been hanging on hold since 2003, in effect. And I think the Trump administration, having really neglected Hong Kong and having given the Chinese the sense that they were not concerned about human rights or democracy, facilitated the decision by Beijing to move ahead in a very heavy-handed and concerning way. It's very difficult to roll back. It's, you know, once the vase has been knocked off the mantelpiece and broken, it's pretty hard to put it back together. I'm not aware of a policy set that could turn the clock back on democracy in Hong Kong, but the administration in Washington clearly takes it very seriously. It's a frequent topic of concern. Lastly, the outbreak of anti-Asian violence, as well as of anti-African American violence in the United States, is heartbreaking and worrisome. I happen to believe that while there has been historically a long submerged strain of deep racism in US society, notwithstanding, or maybe in part because of our immigrant character, there was a broad social understanding that that is wrong. It's immoral, and it's un-American. And that kind of behavior was suppressed, not by force, not by law, but by norms and convention. The 4 years of the Trump administration loosened all of those barriers and really opened the door to the ugliest forms of racism and jingoism in the United States. And it's going to take time and effort to repair that damage. But that's what Joe Biden ran and won the election on, restoring the soul of America. He has spoken out very clearly in condemnation of the anti-Asian violence. He has made it a point to choose as his vice president someone of South Asian and African American descent. You see it in his cabinet. There's no question that priority mission for Joe Biden is to overcome and to get past this really ugly chapter in American society.
Okay, thank you so much. With that, I think the time has come to close our session today. I think we had a very interesting, insightful, and engaging conversation on President Biden's policy toward Asia with our guest speaker, Mr. Daniel Russel. Mr. Russell, once again, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, insights, and engaging in a very interesting conversation with us today. We appreciate your time and trouble. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I will see you next month on Global Dialogue.